Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Sarah and this is my granny era. Today I am going to share with you guys all of my reads in November. I read 8 books in the month of November. It was a pretty productive reading month. The first week of November I made a video and then a mid-month kind of check-in video where I've talked about some of these in detail already. So I'm going to start with the last book I read of the month and work backwards, because when I get to the ones I've already talked about, I will just sort of skim over, right? And you can go watch those other videos for details because you probably don't want to listen to it all over again. So the last book I read was A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. I read this every December. It is just one of my traditions that I love to do. And every year I get something new out of it. I think I've probably read it, I've read it at least 12 times, maybe 13. And maybe more than that so far back in my history that I don't remember. But I know that I've read it at least 12 times, so this is a very familiar story to me. And when you do reread something like that so many times, you do start to pick things out. I don't want to talk too much in detail about A Christmas Carol in this video because I'm actually going to make an entire video about this book here very shortly. So I will just say that one of the things that really has spoke to me the last couple of years about this story is that sometimes people are the way they are, and they're that way because they don't realize there's any other way to be, right? And I think that that is kind of the issue with Scrooge. As the years go by, I love him more and more, and he becomes a character that I feel a lot of compassion for, and that I really want to see succeed, right? And we know that he will. Spoilers if you're not familiar with the story. But we want that for him after a while, after we start to really care about him. And I think he's just a character that doesn't realize there is any other way to be, or that he's forgotten that there is another way and you don't actually have to live the way you're living. So be looking for that video here in the next week or so. I'm going to put up a whole analysis on The Christmas Carol with lots of thoughts and things that just I want to share with you guys. The one before that was The Kamigawa Food Detectives. I did not enjoy this story. This was only a 1-star read for me. There was just several elements that just really bugged me. For one thing, now if you guys have been watching for a little bit, you've heard me kind of not rant, not be irritated, but just paying attention to the fact that all of the books that I have read translated from Japanese have been not so great translations. They've been hard to get into because the translation, I guess, or maybe it is the writing, I don't know, just seems very juvenile, and so I've struggled with them. This one was not written juvenilely at all, but that actually was to its detriment, unfortunately. I think I'd rather go back to the ones that just are kind of wonky translated than what this was, because this seemed to be something that was just retold for a Western audience, inspired by this original story, and I just was not a fan. It was very clear that whoever put this together was trying to introduce the reader to a lot of Japanese ways. And I don't think that, I can't imagine that the original story would be packed out with all of these very tedious explanations about basic Japanese culture. But even with all of that, I can't imagine that someone who is not already familiar with, at the very least, Japanese food and, you know, the actual layout of the country, the street names and these towns and the place, I don't know, geography, I guess, how they could even make heads or tails of this story. I had such a difficult time getting into the descriptions of the food, which I think if you knew what they were talking about, like if you could visualize the food, then I think this could have been a completely different story. But I was not the intended audience for the way this was written. So much of the descriptions of the food, I didn't know what they were talking about, so I couldn't imagine it in my head or even get excited about the flavors that came together and all those things as these characters were. It was kind of like, I don't know, back in the early days of AI, like AI generated images and things. My brother used to send me these images, and he'd be like, you know, what do you think of this or whatever? And you're looking at, it would be like a picture of a bedroom or something. And you knew, like your head told you you were looking at a room full of things. But when you looked at the things, none of it was a thing you were familiar with. I don't know how to describe what I'm trying to say, but if you've seen these, you know what I mean. Like, you'd see a pile of stuff over on the floor, and your head would tell you, well, that's a pile of stuff on the floor. But when you looked at the stuff, none of it was anything that is of this world. None of it was familiar. It was unfamiliar shapes, and it wasn't really anything, but the whole room looked put together if you just glanced at it. It's a room full of stuff, but then when you really look at it, none of these things are actually a thing. That's how it was reading this story for me. They're talking about how glorious and wonderful and, you know, whatever, salivating at all of this food, but I couldn't even picture what the food was to wrap my head around the idea of what it might taste like or smell like or whatever. Does that make sense? It was a hard book for me to enjoy. There was a lot of like encyclopedic sort of interjections in this book that made me believe it wasn't actually translated word for word or even thought for thought in a lot of places. But there was also like a lot of Western sort of isms, like at one point somebody called somebody else a country bumpkin. Is that a thing in Japan? Are there country bumpkins in Japan? I don't know, but it was just weird. But here's an example of a dialogue that made me feel like I can't even relate to this if I don't understand the geography of this country. So character 1 says, "Incredible flavor. I'm guessing the fish is from the inland sea." Character 2 says, "The Yua Bay, I believe." Character 1, "I see. No wonder it tastes so good." Now, most writers would go on to explain what those things have in common. How are they connected? How is the inland sea, why is it so good? Because it's from the Yua Bay of the inland sea. But no, they just continue on with the story, and we're just supposed to believe that that's the way it is. So unless you are familiar, you're just not getting it, right? I kind of felt like I was regularly eavesdropping on two people who were having kind of like a name dropping competition. It just was awkward and difficult to follow. The female main character was very rude, and the rest of the characters didn't even seem to need to be there. It was just a big old meh for me. I was not liking this story at all. All right, now before that, I read The Body in the Library by Agatha Christie. Now, I have been looking for these older versions of the Agatha Christie stories, at least, early 90s, 80s, because a lot of the stories now are being rewritten and taken a lot of her character out of it to make it more appealing to modern audiences and less offensive. And for all of the great reasons that people might have for doing that, I don't prefer that. I would prefer to read what Agatha Christie actually wrote and learn from the good and the bad, right? I went into that in a different video, though. I won't go into all that again tonight. But I did read this 1970 version of The Body in the Library, probably the accurate story that she wrote. And it's one of my favorite stories. It's one of those that I, have watched the Joan Hickson TV shows 1,000 times. And so I knew it really well, right? Their version, the TV version. And of course, it doesn't always line up. I think that I actually, in a lot of ways, enjoyed this story more. It's not as deep as the TV version is. There wasn't as much going on. But the way it played out made me actually like one of the characters a lot more than I did in the TV version. So I enjoyed that quick read and gave it 4 stars. So the rest of these are the books that I talked about in my mid-month check-in and in my first week of November check-in, because I had read so much by that first week that I was just like, I gotta check in now before I get too far in. So I will go through those a little more quickly. This one, The Cemetery of Untold Stories by Julia Alvarez. This was a book that I picked up kind of spontaneously, and it tells the story of Alma. She has come into some money and she purchases some land, and she actually sort of builds a cemetery, but it's not for people, it's for stories. And so she is an author who is thinking herself retired, and she buries some of the stories that she had never finished. However, some of the characters in these stories have a mind of their own, and they find a way to tell their story anyway, even though Alma will not continue on with the story. This was a really fun read and interesting. There was a little bit of history in there regarding the Dominican Republic, and I enjoyed it. It was something I'd never read about before. It was a kind of a new subject for me and told in a pretty creative way. So I did really enjoy the story. I gave it 4 stars. Before that, I read Spare by Prince Harry. This was one of my nonfiction November reads, and is his autobiography. And I always, before reading this, was pretty partial to William and Catherine. Like, if I had to pick, I'd say William is like my favorite prince. But after reading this, I feel a lot more compassionate towards Harry. And it was very interesting to hear his side of things. And while Harry and I are pretty close to the same age, I do have 4 sons, and so reading the story about his growing up years and his point of view on things, I am not so naive to believe that everything he puts here really happened the way he said it happened, right? But I think that reading about his childhood and teenage years and having the 4 sons that I have also helped me to feel a lot of compassion toward him. I did think it was great that he got the opportunity to tell his story, and I am happy for, you know, the life that he has now. It seems like it's probably the best it's ever been for him. So that's a good thing. All right, before that, I read a book called We'll Prescribe You a Cat. I've already sold it on eBay. That's why I don't have it here. Or the Food Detectives one. I sold that one also. So there's this mental health clinic, and people are like referred there. They find out about it somehow, but it's not always there. Like, it kind of appears when you need it, maybe. And when they get inside, they realize this is not your average clinic. So they'll sit down with the doctor. He hears, you know, what your issues are, and then he prescribes you a cat. And that's it. That's your medication. That's your prescription. That's what's going to help you, is the cat. So it just tells stories about different people who were prescribed cats and how that went for them. I felt it was kind of negative. Like, most of the people are just negative. And so that was kind of a bummer. Also, like, I don't know, the stories weren't super, they were kind of boring. So I didn't love it. I think I gave it 2 stars. It was slow and not super deep. The concept was great. And what happened at the very end was a nice little twist. But for the most part, yeah, it didn't float my boat. Before that, I read another book translated from Japanese. This is Before the Coffee Gets Cold. And this is the first in a series of, I think there's like 5 of these. Basically, there's a cafe. And when you go into the cafe and you sit in a certain seat and you receive a cup of coffee from a certain coffee pot that is poured out by a certain waitress, you can go back to a period of your history and relive it. It changes nothing about your current situation. You can't like go back and rewrite the past or anything like that, but it's just something you can relive, and you can only stay there until the coffee gets cold. So that was a pretty genius concept, and I did like the story. I didn't so much like how it was translated. Again, kind of, well, shallow isn't the right word. More just like, it seemed like it was written by like a 12-year-old. And for all of the awards that this guy has supposedly received, I have to believe that it's more about the translation and not necessarily about him, but who knows? Anyway, I liked the concept of it enough to read through it. I did enjoy the book enough to give it 4 stars and to purchase another one in the series. And my 15-year-old daughter read it. I guess liked it. She said she liked it. So we purchased another one. I'm going to read through that, and then she's going to read through it. But this one I'm sending to my mom. And I've just been waiting to make this video so I can send this to my mom. So yay, you can cheer now. Your books are on the way. And then before that, the first book that I read in the month of November was this. This is a book called Pendleton by Keith May. This one is basically a little guidebook, I don't know, history book about the town that my mother lives in Eastern Oregon, that I lived in for quite a while. And like I said in the video when I talked about it, unless you know this town. This book is probably going to be one of those things where you're going to be kind of like I was in that food detectives book, right? Because it talks a lot about like actual street names and actual buildings and places and sorts of things. So it's very like a Eastern Oregon centric sort of a book, but it tells all about this town, this western town that I grew up near. I always lived within an hour or so of Pendleton, Oregon, up until I was 33 when we moved here to Northwest Arkansas. And so it was fun to read about and just, read about the history. It's an Old West town. It was a mining town, and now it's a rodeo town. And so it was fun to read through. So that is my November wrap up. It was a good reading month, and so far December has been a good reading month. I've read 4 books already in December. This is December the 5th, so yeah, I'm making pretty good progress. It's just that cozy season when all you want to do is sit around and drink hot stuff and eat sweet stuff and read books. What better thing is there to do right now? But try to stay warm, right? And happy. So I hope everybody is doing well. I hope you're staying warm and happy. And I will see you soon. Bye-bye.